The future Frank Weld lives alone in a country house suffering from worsening mental disorders. At night, he entertains himself by robbing his own home. One day, he tidies up the house a bit and prepares to eat. But the milk has already soured, so he heads to the couch without having breakfast. Frank is dozing off when his daughter Madison calls from a distant foreign country, but the connection breaks. Later, Frank heads into town, where the last library with real books is located. The librarian, Jennifer, greets him with a smile as few people read real books anymore. She tells him that a new nonprofit organization plans to convert the library to a digital format. At that moment, Frank's son, Hunter, calls, and the elderly man leaves. On his way, he stops by a store where the clerk greets him coldly, suspecting him of petty theft. The old man leaves, ignoring her shouting. As he walks toward his house, Hunter pulls up in his car. Concerned about his father's condition, Hunter visits every 10 days, even though he lives far away. Hunter is horrified by the mess in the house, and admits he would prefer to place his father in a facility where he would be well cared for, but Frank refuses to leave his home. Then Hunter reveals a robot assistant he has bought to help his elderly father. Frank isn't happy with the gift, as he's always been against automation. However, Hunter turns on the robot and instructs it to clean the house and prepare lunch. The machine gets to work, and soon the pair are seated at the table. Frank tries to appeal to his son's emotions, saying their mother wouldn't like this innovation, but Hunter reminds him that his parents separated 30 years ago. At that moment, the robot brings out a cake it made and asks Frank to believe that it will be a good helper. Frank reluctantly agrees. The next day, the robot cleans the house and begins enforcing a daily schedule it has devised for Frank. Now it prepares healthy meals for the old man and comes up with activities like working in the garden. The robot shaves Frank and takes him for a walk. When Frank tries to argue that he doesn't need a helper, the robot informs him that if Frank refuses, its memory will be wiped and it will be sent to storage. This makes Frank reconsider. One day they go to the library, but Frank asks the robot to wait outside. Inside, Jennifer introduces Frank to Jake, the new library owner, and shows him the cabinet holding old books that will soon be discarded. Meanwhile, outside, a group of boys starts bothering the robot, and when Frank comes out, he suggests that the robot scare the bullies next time by saying it has a self-destruct program and starting a countdown. On their way home, Frank and his robot stop by the store, where Frank steals another figurine, but the clerk catches him and demands to see his pockets. Frank manages to put the stolen item back, and the clerk lets him go. However, later, Frank is surprised to find the figurine in the robot's bag. It turns out the robot saw what happened and decided that Frank needed the item more. Frank explains the concept of theft to the robot and begins teaching it how to pick locks, revealing that he has served 2 prison terms for this skill. Frank specialized in stealing jewelry because, as he says, insurance companies are the ones that suffer the most. Seeing that the robot handles the task perfectly, Frank realizes they have new opportunities. The pair head to the library, where Frank shows the robot the locations of the security cameras. He then introduces the robot to Jennifer, who invites him to a party celebrating the library's conversion to digital format. When they return home, Frank tells the robot that they will commit a robbery that night. At that moment, Hunter calls, tired of Madison's constant complaints and her insistence that her brother take the robot back. But now, Frank doesn't want to give up his new partner. That night, the criminal duo head to the library and steal an antique edition of Don Quixote, but Frank doesn't notice that he's left his glasses on the table at home. As Frank examines the book, he recalls how Hunter once asked him to teach him the art of theft. The old man reminisces about his children's antics, but his memories are jumbled. He deeply regrets not paying more attention to them. The next morning, Madison calls, surprised that Frank is so accepting of the robot. She gets upset when Frank mentions that her brother at least did something for him. In the evening, Frank goes to the party with Jennifer at the library, which will now serve as a community center. Jennifer tells him about the nighttime theft, and that Jake suspects the thieves are after the library's new sponsors. Their conversation is interrupted by Jake, who introduces his wife to the pair. He takes Jennifer away for a chat, leaving Frank alone. Frank starts eyeing the women's jewelry, especially the necklace worn by Jake's wife. But Jake approaches the old man, admitting he knows about Frank's criminal past and about the glasses found at the scene. Jake asks Frank not to come back again. Jennifer returns, and Frank suddenly confesses that he thinks Jake is a fraud, but she doesn't understand what he's talking about. Back at home, Frank asks the robot to turn on its visual memory, and as he examines Jake's wife's jewelry, he realizes it's extremely valuable. The robot, realizing what Frank is planning, tries to dissuade him from taking the risk, but the old thief is convinced that devising a criminal plan helps him exercise his brain. They start staking out Jake's house, and during this time, the robot admits it lied about its memory being wiped. It's willing to return to the store to keep Frank from risking his life, since its primary concern is Frank's health. Frank, touched by the robot's admission, asks it never to remind him that it's not alive. Later, Frank begins planning the robbery when Jennifer arrives. Fearing she'll see his notes and figure out what he's up to, he refuses the letter inside. She leaves, placing a pie on his doorstep. The next morning, Frank goes to the library to return the book to Jennifer, but hearing music coming from inside, he turns around and leaves. Later, he continues to stake out Jake's house, telling the robot more about his life. The robot continues caring for the garden and watering the ripening tomatoes. Meanwhile, Madison returns home, determined to convince her father to get rid of the machine, which she sees as ethically unacceptable. She disables the robot using a password Frank doesn't know, and shows her father photos from her recent trip, unaware that it all feels burdensome to him. The next morning, Frank wakes up for the first time in a while without his mechanical friend's wake-up call, and tries to turn the robot back on. But without the password, it's impossible. Madison returns from the store with cereal, which Frank has long since stopped eating because the robot only made healthy breakfasts. Watching Jake's house alone no longer brings him any pleasure. He starts rummaging through the kitchen for food, throwing everything around, and Madison makes him lasagna, but Frank finds it tasteless and asks her to turn the robot back on. She refuses. Later, Frank scolds his daughter for the mess in the house, saying she hasn't done what the robot easily managed. The next morning, Frank notices a striking change. Everything is sparkling clean, and his daughter is busy in the kitchen, assuring him she spent all night cleaning. But Frank catches her in a lie. She simply turned the robot back on. Frank is outraged, saying the robot isn't a servant. It can't just be turned on and off whenever someone wants. Madison reluctantly agrees and turns the robot back on. That night, Frank shares his robbery plan with his robot friend. He explains that the money belongs to Jake's wife, and Jake is just a freeloader. Every evening, the couple goes out to parties, and that's when they'll strike. They'll steal the woman's expensive jewelry. Frank has devised 20 different escape routes, so they're safe. Most importantly, he knows where the security system's control panel is located. At night, the man and the robot break into Jake's house, making their way to the safe. The robot, being much stronger and faster than Frank, cracks the safe, calculating millions of possible combinations. The criminal pair pull off the heist, and although the homeowners return earlier than expected, they manage to escape. But back home, Frank suddenly realizes that the stolen jewelry is too recognizable, and it won't be easy to sell it. He decides to hide it for the time being. The next morning, the robot serves Frank and Madison cocktails when the sheriff arrives with Jake, who is convinced that his neighbor is behind the theft. The sheriff, aware of Frank's criminal past, insists on searching the house, but Madison is baffled, saying she can vouch for her father's innocence. Later, Madison bids farewell to her father, who gives her a pair of expensive earrings that he's had for a long time, advising her to sell them far. Madison leaves, admitting her brother was right about the robot. At that moment, Frank notices a van surveilling his house. He recalls the sheriff entering his home, which means the house could be bugged. He turns up the TV's volume and wonders where to hide the stolen goods. First, he burns all his robbery plans in the fireplace. Then the robot reminds him about its memory, saying the police can review it. The robot asks Frank to erase its memory, but Frank can't bring himself to do it. Desperate for a solution, Frank asks the robot to call Hunter and tell him that Frank is dying. Alarmed by the message, Hunter rushes to his father's house and finds him in bed. Hunter tries to get Frank to go to the hospital, but Frank suddenly confesses that he's been a bad father and asks for his son's forgiveness. He begs Hunter to hide his briefcase without looking inside. Hunter places the briefcase in his car's trunk, but as soon as he drives away, the sheriff emerges from the van and stops him. When they open the briefcase, they find only useless porcelain figurines. The sheriff tells Hunter about the robbery next door, but the son doesn't understand why his father is being accused since he's ill. Just then, Frank casually walks out onto the porch, enraging his son, who had raced over in a panic. Jake remembers they can check the robot's memory to uncover the truth. The police surround the robot, but it suddenly announces that the self-destruct system has been activated and begins a countdown. Seeing Frank make a break for it, the police rush outside. Frank starts Hunter's car and drives away with his friend. Along the way, the robot again asks Frank to erase its memory to avoid any trouble. The pair head to the library, and as Frank talks to Jennifer about the recent events, he notices photos of his children on the wall. Then he spots a photo of himself with Jennifer and suddenly realizes that she is his wife, whom he forgot due to his illness. Frank and the robot return home, sneaking inside before the police station outside notice them. Once again, the robot asks Frank to erase its memory, saying that with a fresh start, they can plan a new heist. Hearing this argument, argument, Frank finally agrees and shuts the robot down. Sometime later, Frank ends up in an adult daycare facility as his dementia progresses, and he can remember very little. His family visits him, and the old man is happy to feel their love and care. As they say goodbye, he slips Hunter a note, hinting that the stolen jewelry is buried under the tomatoes in the garden the robot created. The film wasn't a big success or widely popular, but it's worth watching as it addresses many issues related to aging, family values, and growing old. The unexpected genre, a sci-fi melodrama, should appeal to those seeking something new and unexplored. If you like this video, please like, share, subscribe. Thanks watching my video.